something is becoming, if you will, a little bit more uneasy in Russia because of these large losses.
Russia has said a New Year missile attack that killed at least 89 of its soldiers happened because its troops were using mobile phones, defying a ban. Officials said this had allowed the enemy to locate its target. Ukraine says 400 soldiers were killed and another 300 wounded in the attack on a college for conscripts in Makivka in the occupied Donetsk area. Russia has now admitted that at least 89 died in the strike. Let's talk more about this with William Courtney, former special assistant to the US president for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia, and a former US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Good evening to you, William.
Yes, hi, Carol.
Really good to have you with us. This was a significant attack on a base being used by Russian troops. And we're now being told that this was because its troops were using mobile phones. What do you make of what we're hearing about this particular incident?
Well, of course, we cannot rule that out because we don't really have all the facts. But the practice of blaming little people is something that goes back to Soviet times. Joseph Stalin used to blame failures that were really systemic failures of big factory constructions, things like that. He would blame failures on a few what he called wreckers. Well, that's what the Kremlin is doing now. They're blaming it on basically, soldiers, enlisted personnel, conscripts using a cell phone, when in fact the Russian military bloggers have been saying, how could they have stored ammunition right next to a facility where they have hundreds of troops? The Russian military bloggers, and these are pro-Kremlin military bloggers, they're saying basically the same thing the Ukrainians are saying, that hundreds were killed, not 63, which Russia first said, then 89. The Russian government typically undercounts things, so you can never trust a number from the Russian government. So I think this is another systemic failure. They shouldn't have had so many troops together in one building within range of Ukrainian artillery, and they shouldn't have had those folks in a building right next to an ammunition dump.
Yeah, it does seem extraordinary that should have happened. As you were saying, there's no way to independently verify the figures, but Ukraine is now saying 400 soldiers were killed and another 300 wounded. And Russia does tend to play down the numbers of losses. It does amount to a significant setback, another significant setback for the Russians.
The Russians apparently have also lost hundreds in Kherson. Ukraine, just in recent days, carried out an attack in Kherson, and there are reports that perhaps up to 500 Russians have been killed. The Russians have sent forward these recently mobilized conscripts without training, without adequate preparation. A lot of them don't have the flak vests that they need for protection. And so a lot of those folks are really cannon fodder, and the Russian military has treated them as cannon fodder. But these losses, the 400 or so in Donetsk and now the 500 or so in Kherson, is having a shock effect in Russia. Again, these Russian military bloggers, some of whom are embedded with Russian forces, are expressing shock, and others as well. There was a big demonstration of people in Samara where a number of these conscripts were firm. You don't normally see those kinds of public outpourings. So something is becoming, if you will, a little bit more uneasy in Russia because of these large losses.
Yeah, because if you have a large number of conscripts from a particular area all killed, there's no way that the Russian authorities, however much they try to clamp down on dissent, can prevent their families and other loved ones at home from finding out about what's happening and perhaps being aware of the circumstances in which they died.
Well, for example, in Samara, where quite a number of these concepts were found, there was several hundred local residents came out and with flowers, put flowers down. Well, the Russian authorities can't arrest those people because that would be too much of a shock to the public. But this is the kind of problem that the Soviet Union had in Afghanistan in the 1980s when it invaded. There were so many losses that a group of mothers of soldiers formed and became a lobbying force, if you will, for information about what happened to their sons and for the return of their remains. The Kremlin is now running the same kind of risk that relatives of soldiers are going to band together and demand more accountability from the government.
Is it possible that perhaps these young, untrained conscripts were using their mobile phones, perhaps either weren't aware or didn't have other means of communication, and were using their mobile phones despite this being banned and despite the obvious risks that would create, that their whereabouts could be located?
It is possible, of course, but the Russian authorities have had this problem since the beginning of the war on February 24th when Russia invaded Ukraine. And so they've tried to seize the mobile phones of soldiers in order to prevent this risk. But it is possible that some have been acquired, including when Russian soldiers moved into, took some parts of Ukraine, seizing Ukrainian mobile phones of people. So there's a possibility of risk, but the larger issue is really the systemic question of this kind of a extremely damaging attack could not have occurred if the senior folks had not put them next to an ammo dump and then put 400 people in the same building.
We were talking about this incident. You were talking about Kherson. It does also sound as though around Bakhmut there is some particularly brutal fighting continuing with a huge amount of destruction and loss of lives on both sides.
Yes, it's been puzzling to Ukrainians and the West why Russia is devoting so much effort to seizing Bakhmut, because it's not an especially strategic town to take. So the Ukrainians are trying to resist, but the Russians are bleeding themselves there. And of course, a lot of Ukrainians are dying there as well. But because the Russians are devoting so many resources to the Bakhmut salient, it is possible the Russians are leaving themselves exposed in some other sectors where the Ukrainians could take advantage.
And we're hearing that in that fight, as in some other places, there are, in addition to the Russian armed forces, there are mercenaries from this private Wagner group, the Wagner group, which is Russian-based, but has operated in various other parts of the world. How significant do you think is the role that these mercenaries are playing?
Well, the Wagner Group folks are an independent force which receives support from the Russian Ministry of Defense, but have their own command and control from Prigozhin, who heads the group. And so it's, to some extent, when a government loses the monopoly on force, and so, for example, Wagner Group and then the Chechens, Kadyrov, he also has a somewhat independent military formation. This suggests weakness of a state when it can't control, when it doesn't have a monopoly of force. So questions now, I think, are being raised about the extent to which, while Kadyrov and Prigozhin publicly support the Kremlin, but they also attack Russian military leaders as being incompetent, it's possible that Prigozhin and Kadyrov and their forces at some point could turn against the Russian official forces.
So those are the leaders of these mercenary groups. Those are the leaders of these private mercenary groups that you're talking about there.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
So when we look at the state of the war now, William, there appears to be almost a deadlock, a stalemate. The Russians continuing to launch these attacks, these strikes on energy infrastructure, causing damage and, of course, blackouts as well. Do you think that we could, despite all of this and the setbacks that the Russians have suffered, see a renewed onslaught from the invading forces when we get to the spring?
It is possible that Russia will try some new directions in their invasion, if you will. The damage to the electrical infrastructure has been quite significant in Ukraine, and of course, many people are suffering lack of heat or electricity as a result. The Ukrainians appear to be improving their ability to repair this damage more quickly, and they are improving their ability to shoot down the drones. Make a distinction between the drones, which are slow flying, and missiles, which are fast flying and are more difficult to knock down. The question for the drones is drones are relatively cheap, maybe $20,000, and Ukraine needs to be able to destroy those in a cost-effective way. So using anti-aircraft missiles, for example, against them, those missiles cost a lot more than the drones. So there's a challenge here for finding ways such as machine gun with better fire control systems to take out those drones. That's still an issue that Ukraine is trying to develop their capability.
William Courtney, former Special Assistant to the US President for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia, former US Ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Really good to speak to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Stay with